for me, literally just in my body, in order for me to be free as a queer, Black, and Jewish woman, sexism has to stop. Anti-Blackness has to stop. Anti-Semitism has to stop. Queerphobia has to stop.
Hey, I'm Ashley Jackson, and this is Push the Next Generation, your Gen Z-coded guide to power and politics. Today we're decoding collective liberation. Since there's so much post-Thanksgiving tea to unpack, I've opted to move our news update to the end this week. The fun thing about a first season is that we can just try things out. Very low pressure. We love a good format change. So fun times are ahead. Now, here comes my usual. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel, Push the Next Generation, recommend it to a friend, follow on socials at Push the Next Generation Pod, and subscribe wherever you listen to your podcasts. Okay, now that the begging is over, let's get into it. This week, I'll be speaking with Raven Schwam-Curtis, known to many as Raven Reveals. She's a full-time content creator, keynote speaker, and recent Northwestern University graduate. Her research explores intersectional histories with a focus on Black and Jewish relationality. Bringing the expertise of academia to life in digital spaces allows Raven to serve the communities she loves and cherishes. Her work has been featured in Glamour Magazine, The Washington Post, USA Today, and BuzzFeed. And as Gen Z increasingly turns to digital methods of learning, educators need to adapt, and as a member of Gen Z themselves, Raven is up for the challenge. Raven and I met this year as DNC Creators, and I'm so excited to welcome her to the podcast. Quick note, this is the last of our pre-election interviews, and I kept the content intact because I really believe that our discussions of the youth voting bloc and the importance of voting are resonant no matter the season. Welcome, Raven. Hi, Raven.
Hi, Ashley.
This is so exciting. So we're here on Push the Next Generation. We're going to ask you a few questions today, but mainly I think, and this is really nice because we are friends outside of this space, and so I feel like this will be a very colloquial, fun dialogue. But I am going to start with just asking you on a basic level, like, who are your inspirations? Like, who do you look up to?
Well, I have so many inspirations, but like first thing that comes to mind, obviously, are the women in my life who have deeply inspired me, who have taught me how important it is to be politically engaged and activated. So I think of my mom, I think of my grandmother. But in terms of, thought leaders, the first folks who come to mind are Grace Lee Boggs, who has been really, really instructive for me as someone who has deeply researched Afro-Asian solidarity and coalition building and just imagining how we can build bridges between communities on the margins, as well as Audre Lorde. One of the first texts that I ever read that really radicalized me was Sister Outsider, which is a collection of essays by Audre Lorde, who is a Black woman, lesbian poet, who speaks really powerfully about the experiences of Black women navigating these various interstitials and communities where we experience subjugation, and how we can hold all those complications with and for one another in ways that are deeply loving. So yeah, really just powerful women who are dedicated to a spacious world.
No, that's really beautiful, and I think that these inspirations actually really do come through your work, and so it's really nice to see like this is where Raven gets it from. What inspired you to become what inspired you to become politically engaged and start your own platform? Because I think that we can all be politically engaged, but you've made a name for yourself in this space, so I'm really curious about that choice. But then also how does your identity as a Black and Jewish creator influence your perspective on these complex political issues that you discuss?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, I think fundamentally what inspired me to become politically engaged was this recognition that the personal is political and the political is personal. I was definitely radicalized in undergrad. My majors were feminist gender and sexuality studies and Asian studies with a concentration in China, with minors in Africana studies and inequality studies.
That'll do it.
Yeah, right? Like all the things, very overachiever vibes. But no, really, I was very intentional about choosing those areas of study for myself because I wanted to center histories that I felt like had not been centered in my high school education, which was largely Eurocentric. And I think by delving into those histories, what became very, very clear to me is that the personal is political and the political is personal. Like we as peoples that experience subjugation don't have the privilege of disengaging from the political. Because even if we don't choose politics, politics are going to choose us.
Absolutely.
And so I think first and foremost, that's what radicalized me. And then in terms of my turn to the social media space, straight out of undergrad, I went into an MA PhD program in Black Studies. Mm-hmm. And if there's anything that'll radicalize you further, it's the Black radical tradition. And that's exactly for me in the most beautiful and capacious way. And, I think what I became very frustrated about as I was navigating academia was what felt like this impenetrable elitism. This idea that if you didn't have access to certain language or jargon, that you couldn't understand these concepts that were being communicated in academic journals that, to me, felt deeply paramount and still feel deeply paramount. And so my turn to the social media space was about taking what I was learning in the classroom in ways that weren't necessarily terribly accessible to the average person, and translating them in a very bell Hooksian spirit to the online space so that anyone who's on their way to work can watch my 45-second video about the difference between being white appearing and white passing, and do that consciousness raising in a way that's generative but not so time consuming.
No, that's really beautiful, and that's kind of what I'm trying to do with this podcast. Is like I'm consistently in these spaces where I'm like, I have exclusive access to, let's say, this conversation or this experience, but like our generation deserves to be in the conversation too. And especially being, I think, raised by older parents, like a lot of those spaces I'm in are with people who, like, I am the only person from Gen Z who's in the room at all. So like making sure that we can bring everybody to the table and having that level of inclusivity is really important. But we're going to shift gears really quickly. As you know, we're living through some times, I'll say, right now, like in every sense of the word, we're living through some times. And I would just love for you to share some examples on how your content has fostered dialogue between Black and Jewish audiences, and I mean the intersectionality of that existence for yourself, and like what impact you've seen from these interactions and what the response has been to you from both communities and the community that is both Black and Jewish.
Yeah, wow, big question. I mean, we are living
So just a little something.
I see we're starting out easy. Oh my goodness. Well, I mean, I think, some of the ways that I've sought to foster sort of solidarity between the Black and Jewish communities is simply through basic education. I think part of the ways that our educational systems have failed us are by not connecting those dots, not underlining how explicitly we have built bridges with one another, right? Some of the canonical examples that we think of in terms of Black and Jewish relationality are folks like Rabbi Heschel marching with MLK, praying with his feet. Folks like Andrew Goodman, who participated in Freedom Summer, trying to support, Black folks' ability to fight against voter suppression and for our access to the ballot, and unfortunately lost his life in the process because of white supremacists, right? Like, these are the stories that don't get elevated. And I think what became clear to me as I started discussing more of my experiences being a Black and Jewish woman in the online space was that part of the perception of division was a lack of understanding around our connectivity. So really part of the work is elevating those stories. But, I think I would be remiss not to name, obviously, the particular political moment that we're in with everything transpiring in Gaza and Israel, and how incredibly painful I think that has been for folks who are Black, for folks who are Jewish, for folks who are Black and Jewish, and navigating these interstitials in a moment where it feels like there is this profound fissuring between our communities.
Yeah.
And look, I certainly don't have all the answers, but I think part of my work over this last year since October 7th has been trying to underline, like, what are the ways that we're speaking over and across one another? What are the ways, for example, in which we're engaging in transactional activism? I march with you for this, and therefore you owe me solidarity in this specific way that I want it. How can we disrupt those impulses and instead invite one another into deeper clarity about how we arrive to our politics?
Yeah.
And even if we can't arrive to agreement around this issue, which is painful and frustrating, still recognize the importance of coalition building around other issues, because even if we can't arrive to collective consensus around what's transpiring in Gaza and Israel, we still need to fight for reproductive freedoms here at home, and there's deep alignment there, right? We still need to fight against voter suppression here at home, and there's deep alignment there. We still have these histories of collaborating together via the NAACP and so on and so forth. Like, that work is still there to be done. So I think part of my labor has been how can we hold the both end of discomfort and disagreement while still leaning into coalition.
No, definitely. And I feel like such a valley girl for saying no at the beginning of every response, by the way. Like, I hear myself being like, no, no. So with that though, like, it's so interesting because one of my favorite, I would say, she's a faith leader, but also a thought leader I really hold dear, Rabbi Sharon Brous, and this notion of our hearts being capacious enough to hold all of these things at once and that level of nuance. I think you so beautifully do it on your platform, but like that, I think, is where conversations often get started. Like when you are expansive enough, when you hold enough to be like, you know what? I'm going to meet you where you are today. Now, obviously, there's levels and layers to that. You call me a derogatory term, we're having a different conversation. But like, I'm like, we can get into that in a second. But just in terms of this notion of like, there is a lot going on in the world right now. And like, frankly, there are some days where I get up and I'm just like, what are we doing? Like, I actually don't know how to function through some of this, and that's something that I'll ask you about in a bit, but just the notion that there is a both and to all of these situations and how we can find the common ground. And I'm really grateful to content creators like you who have platforms that seem to be really encouraging people to find common ground rather than continuing divisive rhetoric on the internet, which is a not fun place to be sometimes. But I would just, and speaking to that point, I'd love to know how you balance like your audience on political issues while also encouraging, educating them on political issues while also encouraging them to form their own opinions, especially on complex or controversial topics or situations like October 7th, et cetera. Like, where do you find your like, this is Raven sharing my thought versus this is me being like, yeah, no, your thought's problematic. Like, how do you navigate that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's a great question. I think my approach has been, this is just my positionality that I'm sharing, right? I'm one person in the world with my own particular, distinct Black and Jewish experience. I'm not the mouthpiece for every single Black and Jewish person, right? Like, I am simply speaking from my education, from my positionality, and you came to my page because you feel alignment there sometimes, and then maybe sometimes you don't feel alignment. And in the moments where you don't, let's talk about it. I always welcome respectful dialogue and disagreement on my page. Keyword respectful, because when it's not respectful, you will be restricted and you will be blocked. And those
blocked with a T.
With a T, blocked.
Blocked.
Absolutely. So, that's one thing. That's when I'm sharing my own opinions on what's happening in the political zeitgeist. And then other times, I'm a little more definitive in why I'm speaking out. For example, if I see someone who, for example, this is a great example I actually think of. There was just this like big Christian nationalist march in or
oh my
organizing.
God. It was so freaking weird. Sorry. I'm like, I do not care about people's religious beliefs. That march was weird in every sense of the word. And please tell the people what we witnessed the other day.
Yeah. So an unfortunate story to have to tell. Tens of thousands of Christian nationalists gathered in DC for what was a pro-Trump, anti-trans, and using weird, taking from Jewish iconography in ways that felt deeply, deeply appropriative. On Yom Kippur, there were shofars at this event and flags at this event. It was a deeply, deeply bizarre gathering that basically posited something that is deeply violent to communities on the margins, which is Christian nationalism, which I understand to be the imposition of certain myopic and parochial readings of Christianity that are then coercively pushed into legislation in a way that doesn't represent what the majority of constituents want. That is the danger of Christian nationalism, and there was this whole gathering to promote it over the weekend. So, when I'm talking about something like that, I'm not holding the both and in that conversation respectfully. That is bigotry, that is dangerous, and it does need to be collectively condemned. So that's a very different posturing than when I'm just sharing my personal opinion.
Yeah, it was really like a scene out of Righteous Gemstones, and I was just sitting there like, that is a satirical show. This should not be our day-to-day lives. And I feel like in this weird space of disillusionment every day. But so speaking more about like Gen Z, the Gen Z of it all, what strategies have you found to be most effective in motivating Gen Z to participate in the political process? And like, what would you consider to be the top political priorities for Gen Z voters compared to older generations?
I mean, I don't know that I've had to really mobilize my audience that deeply. I think because my page is predominantly political and educational in nature, folks that gravitate to me are already activated in some facility. So I view my job more so as being a vehicle to elevate what's happening topically so that folks who aren't necessarily in the nitty gritty in the way that I am can stay abreast of what's going on and engage. And I share those calls to action, whether it's phone banking or signing petitions to prevent folks from being, sent to the death chair for the death penalty, things like that. Like that's what I see the role as a vessel for elevating. But the other question was, sorry, remind me.
Yes, the other question was in terms of like, what are the top political priorities for Gen Z voters that you see compared to older generations?
Yeah. I mean, I think top issues that I see our generation talking about are repro. We're talking about the economy, right? Folks are not able to pay their rent, or you have to have 3 and 4 roommates in order to live comfortably for a lot of folks. But obviously, I think Gaza is at the top of our list, and climate are at the top of our list, perhaps in a way that is not as reflective as older generations, which is not to say they don't care, but I think it's obviously a prime issue for young voters. And I think those 4 issues have been at the epicenter of what I'm elevating on my platform as a result.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. And I think it's really important, and as a Gen Zer who follows you, I think that like you really do speak to like a niche audience in a way, but also one that feels incredibly expansive in its reach and like the types of people that you're gathering, which I think is super, super cool. And to that point, we both were DNC creators this year, and we're two of 200 people, so we have a wide array of different types of influencers and content creators. And I would just love to know, as an overarching, what role do you think that influencers and content creators play in shaping political opinions among young voters? Like, this is just one space that we're trying to cultivate now, but there are so many different spaces that people can go. And like, what do you think we're doing as a whole, as a block of people, I would say?
I think we play an incredibly important role in reaching young voters. The media landscape has changed tremendously over the last 10 years. You and I have seen it as part of a generation that has grown up with the advent of the influencer. That wasn't a thing in 2000, right? That's a very, very new phenomenon. And obviously, this industry and this space has only grown exponentially to such an extent that for the first year, the DNC invited yourself and myself, 200 content creators. And not only were we in that space, we were in that space as part of the media landscape, the press landscape. We had press credentials. And I think that's really reflective of this shift in recognition of how we're playing a different kind of role, particularly in a moment where there's rising distrust in institutions, whether those institutions are legacy press or whether those institutions are capital G government. I think our generation is moving through a moment of profound disillusionment. And I would argue for very good reason. I think we've been deeply failed in many ways by people and organizations that were and are supposed to protect us. How could we or why would we trust institutions when we're the generation that grew up doing shooter drills in schools? Why would we trust institutions? You know what I mean? Like when we're the generation watching the climate crisis be exacerbated because the people who are supposed to have our collective interests in mind are prioritizing billionaires and big oil. Why wouldn't we be disillusioned? Of course, we're turning towards one another because we recognize that institutions don't get us free, we get us free. And I think this shift to listening, folks getting their news from more content creators like myself and yourself is a reflection of that disillusionment.
Yeah, 100%. And I think like even myself, like when people ask like what are your top news sources, and like granted, because I think I exist, as we talked about, like in this duality of like I think like the traditional and the legacy, like that is a part of who I am. So yes, I'm watching MSNBC and catching up on all the clips, but like there is a big part of me that's like, I go to Threads to see what happened the night before. Like I think I start my day now on Threads, which is something I never thought I would say when Threads came out, but I mean it's better than the Dead Bird app, so I'll take it. But like I mean there's so many nuances and layers to how we're getting information now, and the amount of disinformation is like also its own thing. But I do see this trend towards looking towards people who you really do believe that you can trust. Like frankly, outside of us knowing each other, like I trusted your content. I know that you are well versed in what you're talking about. And so yeah, I'm like, okay, Raymond's not just talking. She has citations. She backs up her stuff, which also I would just say for the record, everyone listening, please make sure that you are looking at information that has backed up information. We're not just out here touting opinions as facts anymore, people. It's 2024. A lot's on the line. So that would just be a thing that I would really encourage to add, because I see a lot of that these days. I feel like, I don't know about you, where like people will just say things and I'm like, this is like what I guess I would call in my own terms is like Twitter intellect, where there's this notion of like, oh yeah, I saw that opinion, I agreed with it, that's it. Like, no, the internet is actually too vast for us not to be checking our sources and making sure that we are being responsible and actually to that point, one of the things that I thought was really interesting, Connie Chung, legacy reporter extraordinaire, trailblazer, and all the words, she was doing some interviews recently about her new book, and she was talking about this whole notion of like what has happened to legacy media and like all the ways that it has failed, essentially. And I'm paraphrasing, sorry, Connie. But to that point, the distrust shows up because she shows at the same time that like these news organizations used to like not air anything without fact checking or doing their due diligence in the ways that they could be. And then when corporations bought these institutions, everything changed. And now we have even, I mean, your average political pundit, like, you know what their opinion is. And so I think it's really interesting now that we're seeing people, I think, almost clinging to people who have opinions. Like you and I, very clearly, like our opinions are very much on the page, but there's a level, I think, of detachment from the actual structures that feel like, okay, everyone's sharing opinions now, but you guys are sharing your actual opinions, which I trust and are valid, versus like someone whose opinion is based on the check that they're getting in a particular way. I don't know, like, if that is resonating with you, but feel free to add. But yeah, that's just my general 2 cents on the whole legacy versus content creator of it all.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think what you're underlining is really important. This idea of like opinions and the fallacy in a way of like impartiality. I don't necessarily think that impartiality exists in this current media landscape, whether it be legacy media or content creators like us. I
Yeah.
think we're all just consuming what's happening in the zeitgeist from whatever sources we choose, which impacts how we process and do the consuming, and then sharing our positionalities. And it really is, in some ways, it feels like I don't know, just like who has the best hot take, and that's what's hitting with audiences. And you know, it's interesting to be a part of that landscape in a moment where the more sensationalist you are in sharing your position, the more you're rewarded. And I think sometimes that's generative when the sensationalism is rooted in a desire for progress and social good, but also potentially dangerous when that sensationalism is rooted in things like outrage marketing or, you know, spreading dis or mis or malinformation. And to your earlier point, that is a huge issue, I think, across all media landscapes, and one that I think these apps and platforms are going to have to continue to reckon with. We already see some of these sort of maneuvers, like on X, there's a little disinformation box that will pop up or a fact check box. But I think as especially AI becomes a bigger part of these spaces, those maneuvers to make it clear to audiences what it is that they're consuming and to what extent it's accurate are going to have to become more refined and precise.
Absolutely, especially when we look now at like the deep fake population and how like literal political ads that like I think that our notion of what we can trust in terms of what we actually see and consume is getting smaller and smaller, but the notion that an ad you're looking at may not be an ad from whatever campaign is like deeply concerning, deeply problematic, and also very scary. So trying to like hold that in the midst of like being like, I just want to make good decisions as an informed voter has been really hard. But I'd love to know your take on like how candidates and like political parties and traditional political institutions can better connect and engage with young voters. Because I feel like, to your point about this disillusionment, it also sometimes results in like apathy and also just being like, I'm not doing it anymore. I'm out. I'm going to go I'm going to go over here and not engage. But like, we also know how detrimental that is when we're already existing in a world where voter suppression is so rampant. Like, how do you think that these institutions, whether it's media or capital G government, should be better engaging our generation?
Well, I think one thing that has become very clear to me is that our generation is unwilling to accept niceties in the form of things that sound nice that politicians say without seeing actions to back it up. So I guess the biggest piece of advice that I would give to institutions or capital G government that wants to win back our trust is to not just say the nice things like we want a ceasefire, but to do the nice things like make sure a ceasefire happens, right? I think we just have access as a young generation to too much information to be swayed by nice words that aren't backed up by meaningful action.
Right. Absolutely. Switching gears again, would you mind discussing the importance of intersectionality in political discussions, especially for Gen Z audiences, and why it's important to address the nuanced experiences of Black and Jewish groups in relation to global and domestic politics? Referencing that specifically because that's your background, but also I think that these two particular groups actually have a lot to say and a lot to say in terms of our global identity, our domestic identity, and have wide reach and also impacts that largely, shape the way that we operate in the world. So I've just thrown a lot at you. Figure out what feels resonant and please respond.
Sure, sure, sure. No, lots of thoughts. The synapses are firing in my brain very quickly right now. Yeah, I mean, I think what's important to name at the outset of answering this question is that we are the most diverse generation in this country's history. About 50%, about 50% of Gen Z identifies as people of color. So when we're talking about the importance of suffusing intersectionality into conversations around politics, the conversation has to start from that baseline. Basically, intersectionality is just this jargony term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw that does important work. But what it very simply means is let's always hold the complexity of what it means to exist at various interstitials, to be multiracial as I am, or to be, interfaith as many families are. What does it look like to navigate these messy in-betweens that are becoming increasingly common as intermarriage rates and interracial rates of partnering are increasing across the nation? These are conversations we have to confront, not just in our personal lives, but obviously in our politics, because the political is personal and the personal is political. And I think for me, the way that shows up when we talk about Black and Jewish relationality is that all things are Jewish issues, all things are Black issues. And by that I mean, during the summer of 2020, when the Movement for Black Lives was organizing to end police brutality against the Black community, I saw that fundamentally as a Jewish issue, right? Our tradition as Jewish people teaches us that social justice is righteous, that tikkun olam, this idea of world repair, is something we all have a distinct responsibility to make actionable in the world. And so part of that world repair necessarily is making sure that Black folks feel safe and held in a country that we built for free. Part of doing that work is making sure that Black Jews who are in community feel as though their Jewish brothers and sisters and siblings who are not also Black care deeply about their particular lived experience as Black folks. Part of what it looks like to express that care and hold that intersectionality is having nuanced and hard conversations about what it looks like during high holidays for everyone to feel safe. Because for someone perhaps who is Ashkenazi and white appearing, safety might look like having an increased police presence, particularly when Jewish folks experience the huge brunt of religious hate crimes in the United States statistically, versus a Black Jew who may have a different experience with policing because of the ways that Black folks have been racialized in this country and encountered things like slave patrols. It may not imagine safety in the same way. It may in fact feel deeply unsafe by the increased presence of police forces in a religious space. And so I think everything is suffused in these logics of intersectionality. We have to confront it at every level. And when we refuse to, when we silo ourselves into these single issue struggles, as Audre Lorde said, there's no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. And I think that is becoming increasingly important to confront in our politics and our personal lives.
Absolutely. And to your point, and I thought that what you really said was profound about this notion of sometimes safety looks a little different for someone who's holding these levels of these interstitials in their own spaces versus walking in different rooms and being oh, policing is a really big thing. And that crossover, I think is really important to note, because even on college campuses, after the protests began on my college campus, I was walking to class and the level of unsafe I felt was incredibly magnified by the fact that I was walking past several LAPD officers on my way to class. And in many ways, I'm a privileged woman, but I'm also still a Black woman. So that in itself, I was just I don't like how this feels. But for some other Jewish classmates, that might have made them feel more safe. And also for my Palestinian classmates, it didn't make them feel safe at all. So there's so many levels to that. And I think especially when we're having these heightened conversations on college campuses, actually taking the time to sit and really parse out that discussion would really be helpful in our generation. And I've even seen on Columbia's campus, for example, during I believe it was during high holidays, they had this conversation kind of table, which I thought was really cute. But also, like, that is the work. It's like, let's just have a conversation and start from somewhere, because without the dialogue, we can't actually get to the next step of mobilizing together. But so I would love to know how you address anti-Semitism and anti-Blackness in your content, but also, I guess, a larger question would also be like in the world, because I think the interesting thing about these two notions and the way that we have to exist in the world is that, like, sometimes you're encountering anti-Blackness in spaces that are Jewish, and then sometimes you're encountering anti-Semitism in spaces that are Black, and then also you're holding it all. Like, how do you do it online, but also just like as a human? Because I think that it's really important sometimes for us to have distinctions between, like, yes, you have an online presence, you are also like a 25-year-old woman out in the world. Like, they're like, I think sometimes we can be like, oh, that's Raven Reveals. Well, like, no, that's also actually Raven Schwam-Curtis. So like, there's like, those are two things. And so how do you hold all of that online in your own personal world, I guess?
It's a really fabulous question and a deeply personal question, I think. I'll tackle the personal world aspect first. You know, I think for those of us who exist at various interstitials, having to hold when one community that we belong to is being violent towards another community that we belong to is a deeply painful experience. Like when I speak to a relative on my Black side of the family who makes a deeply anti-Semitic comment about how all Jewish people are rich, and they think that they're complimenting me or saying something nice, but don't realize that they're
Yeah.
reifying and regurgitating a trope that is actually deeply violent historically and contemporarily towards the Jewish community.
Mm-hmm.
Or an experience that I had that I grieved about very publicly online, and the only video you'll find of me crying on the internet, where I went to a Torah study with a rabbi who was a white appearing Ashkenazi man, and I made a connection between the Torah portion we were studying and something that W.E.B. Du Bois had written, because I bring Black studies into a lot of things, and he was very enthusiastic about it and pulled up the passage I was referring to in Du Bois's work, and that word had, a passage rather, had the N word and the C word in it. And this rabbi proceeded to read everything, saying the N word with the hard ER, as well as the C word,
Mm-hmm.
during Torah study. And so now suddenly, a space that I'm supposed to feel safe in with other Jewish people is steeped in anti-Blackness and feels deeply violent. And now I no longer feel safe in this community space.
Mm-hmm.
It's a lot to negotiate and navigate. And I think there are no easy answers here, but what I've learned is that part of my role is being the link, right?
Yeah.
Elucidating why it is that that thing that you said that you thought was permissible or acceptable is actually deeply violent. And that if you care about me, if you love me as a family member or a community member, you will do the work to understand how you
Mm-hmm.
feel that way. And then I think, you know, on a broader level, in terms of anti-Blackness and anti-Semitism and how we can and should be connecting these technologies of hatred, so much of the work that I do in the online space is framing everything through a lens of collective liberation. And
Mm-hmm.
the reason that I arrived to those politics is not unique to me. I didn't coin this or create this. It's through my training as someone who was in a program, you know, oriented by women of color feminisms and those teachings and insights and wisdoms,
Yeah.
that I fundamentally recognize that for me, literally just in my body, in order for me to be free as a queer, Black, and Jewish woman, sexism has to stop. Anti-Blackness has to stop. Anti-Semitism has to stop. Queerphobia has to stop. I cannot be
Mm-hmm.
free in my own body, in my own inner world, and in the world writ large until all those things are eradicated from the face of the planet. And so, on a very basic level, even within my own spirit, like these things are deeply interconnected. And then obviously across time and space, we see that when one community on the margins wins, all communities on the margins win. But when we opt into things like white flight or white privilege or the allure of white supremacy, thinking that it'll get us safe, thinking that it'll get us free, what we actually do is produce the conditions for our own unfreedom and the unfreedom of the communities that we say we love and care about. And, you know, I think the work for me has been underlining that lens of collective liberation and why we should all be leaning into it so heavily.
No, that's so powerful. And I feel like everyone's going to take a minute to listen to that 2 or 3 times do some Googling, do some reflecting, because it's just, I feel like that is at the core of so much that I care about as my own human self. And so it's just really beautiful to have it put together that way. But also, like, I think for me, this notion of like liberation not having to come at the expense of someone else's oppression is like a really interesting nuance that I think we're seeing a lot now, where it does feel like all of these pros and antis and this, we live in such a binary system now where there's not even like room to hold, as we've been kind of talking about throughout this episode, this room to hold all these things together. And I would just say, you know, you're doing it beautifully, friend. But in the midst of all of the things. And so an additional question, before we wrap up, I have, okay, 2 more questions. So this is a very girly pop question. So, all right, we're both 25, and we're in a very interesting, this is being recorded, FYI guys, pre-election. We'll see when it comes out, but it's being recorded before the current election, and we're in this election season. And I found myself at times really struggling to process, you know, our global realities, self-care, dating life, binge watching TV, spiritual practice, living, like it's just all the things. And so I'd love to know for you, do you feel like you've mastered the balance? And if so, what are your tips? And if not, how are you grappling with the fullness of existence right now? Like, how are you taking care of yourself? Do you feel overwhelmed? I think that this is a question that like all of the Gen Zers who are like chronically online, at some point we're all feeling the feelings. And so I just want to know how you're processing it in hopes that it might help someone else process.
Oh, wow. You know, I'm not going to sit up here and lie to you and say I'm keeping it all together. I've got the perfect balance, because I'm running on 6 hours of sleep as we speak, because I was up till the wee hours of the morning working. I definitely feel deeply imbalanced, but also if it's any like solace to anyone, I don't think that's atypical. I think it would actually be bizarre if we were feeling balanced given the profound state of chaos and unbalance that we find ourselves navigating in this moment. So not that we relish other folks suffering, but I think we very much are all in it together. That being said, you know, we don't have to simply allow it to happen to us. There are many different tools in our toolbox that we can tap into or utilize to mitigate those feelings of overwhelm. And I think for me, grounding into spirituality has been, you know, a big part of how I've navigated this moment, listening to, you know, leaders like Rabbi Sharon Brous, who I think are speaking truth to power in such powerful and resonant ways. Finding spiritual spaces, whether it's, you know, me listening to Minyan on like a podcast, or listening to, you know, a couple of remarks by a rabbi on YouTube, or going to my favorite thought leaders who always soothe me and remind me that there are people in the world holding the both and, who are not devolving into binaristic, tribalistic, us versus them positionalities and things. Those are the people that I'm turning to because they give me hope. And I think having a methodology to continue feeding yourself hope is so important. And, you know, in addition to that, just basic life things, right? Like, I'm doing my best to take good care of my body and nourish myself, eat foods that I know make me feel good. I'm things like movement. I'm training for a half marathon right now, which is really
wild.
So fun.
I'm like, what is she doing now? Like, oh, I did all this stuff today and now I'm running like 6 miles. What? Okay.
But it's very meditative for me, and afterwards I feel so grounded and good in my body. I'm going out to the lake. I live in Chicago, literally touching the water, putting my feet in the water, touching grass. Like, you know inherently what feeds us, what fills us up. But I think what happens when we get into this state of overwhelm is we don't do the things that we know nourish us. And so it creates this like negative feedback loop that exacerbates the issue. But we have to, I think in this moment especially, be really intentional about choosing us, choosing care, and choosing community.
Absolutely. And well, I would just say to that point, you are definitely one of the thought leaders I go to. I recommend everyone listening go to you too, just because like it's one thing, and like I hold, and I think we've mentioned honestly Rabbi Sharon Brous 20 times in this episode. Clearly we both enjoy her immensely, so check her out. But like finding also, I think, like-minded peers is a really important way to kind of get through the moment, because having community in every sense of the word, but like also it's nice to be like, okay, like this person is my age, and like, yeah, we're holding it, but we're holding it all together. And so finding that space, I think, is really important. And before we wrap up with a question from someone who is another Gen Zer, I would just love to know from you, speaking of this level of hope, actually, like, how do you see the political landscape changing as Gen Z becomes a larger portion of the electorate? Like, we look at people like Congressman Maxwell Frost, like we are moving into a new ball game. Like we're hopefully going to be continuing and like seeing the different PACs that are trying to motivate us to run for office and these different things. Like, what brings you hope about the future of Gen Z engagement in the political space, and what would you recommend someone do if they want to get interested in that and get involved in that kind of space?
Well, first and foremost, I'll say if you're thinking about running for office and you are a member of Gen Z, please go forth. We need more of us in those spaces.
Please.
Please go forth. I don't know the exact method to get involved other than like sharing your voice online, contacting your local leaders, right? Asking very directly, how can I get involved? How can I run for office? Even if you're starting from zero, I think anything is possible. We need more of us in those spaces. So please seriously consider it. I think as more Gen Z moves into the political sphere, it can only go up from here. It can
Yeah.
only go up from here. And I think we have a different kind of skin in the game, right?
Yeah.
Because of sort of what I was elucidating earlier around being the generation that grew up doing shooter drills, being the generation that is now going to have to bear the brunt of the climate crisis in a lot of ways. Like,
Yeah.
it's unfortunate, but I think because we're at a breaking point around so many of these social issues, we are the generation that is going to have to and is already confronting these issues in a very serious way, and not just speaking about them, but doing something about them. And I think my most fervent hope and belief is that as we move into these positions of power, we'll use that power for good, to pour into community, to pour into one another, and to create a world and a country that we're proud to be a part of.
That is so, so powerful. And as we gear into election season and practice down ballot voting, I'll say it again for the people in the back. It's one thing to just vote for who we know is not going to destroy us in many ways, but like also making sure that we're looking out on a local level, state level, all the different levels. Before we ask the question from our Gen Z guest, I actually do have one quick follow-up for you. In terms of like the election we're looking at right now, and in light of all the things that we've discussed, like there are many issues that people care deeply about in this election. For myself too, like I'm looking like, okay, I'm 25, I want to have kids at some point. God forbid that has to happen through IVF. Now it's taken away, depending on like all of these things. Like there's a lot to be fearful about and a lot to be hopeful for. How do you reconcile? Because I know that there's a lot of discussion actually in our generation, rightfully so, that like there's certain policies and agendas that like we may not agree with on either side, right? Like there may be something where like, okay, I'm a registered Democrat, sure, I think it's very clear where I stand on a lot of issues, but like I may not agree with the party on every single thing. How do you, Raven, reconcile with holding all the things that we've discussed in your choice to rally behind certain candidates in this election that maybe can motivate others as we look between, like, for me, some things just feel like life and death right now. And like, yeah, I'm not going to like everything, but like, I also know the alternative might be a lot more harmful than like me settling right now. And I don't even want to use the word settling, but I feel like that's where some people feel like they are. And so, like, how are you justifying that to yourself and to your followers? And then we'll ask our last question.
Sure. No, I think you just said something so powerful right there, Ashley, about life and death. And to me, the first thing that comes to mind when I'm thinking about this question is voting as a tactic for survival. Voting as not necessarily a wholesale endorsement of everything that Canada has said or done, because like you, I have many grievances with the party writ large. I have many grievances with the candidates we have right in front of us, all up and down the ballot, right? But I recognize that voting is a tactic. Even if I were to opt out, which is something I would never do, but if I were to opt out, that doesn't mean that people who are bigoted are not going to opt out too. They're still going to the polls. They're still voting. Do you want to relinquish your power to people who don't love you, who don't care about you, who are not making decisions with your interests, your life, your livelihood, and heart? I would never relinquish my power in that way, particularly as someone who belongs to two communities with incredibly powerful legacies of fighting for these particular rights, right? Why would I relinquish that right when I grew up hearing stories of my grandparents marching in the streets so that they could go to the ballot box? Why would I ever relinquish my power in that way? And so I think first and foremost, it's about survival. Secondly, it's about honoring my ancestors, my elders who have fought fervently for me to have this right in the first place.
Right.
And then, I think fundamentally too, it's about recognizing that politicians should not be deified, right? Politicians aren't celebrities, they're public servants. And the goal is not to get them into public office and then let them run buck wild. The goal is to get them into office and continue to dissent and organize under them, continue to push them in the ways and the directions and towards the policies that we want them to endorse and actualize. The work just begins when people get in office, which I know is a bit of a cliche thing to say, but I think it is deeply true. Right. And I also think, I'll just say lastly, it depends on what you think capital G government or these institutions are doing for us. I'm not someone who is a student of the Black radical tradition who believes that capital G government is going to get us free. I think we can reform and change things to make them better and less harmful, harm mitigation, that's part of the work. But I don't think these institutions are going to get us free. I think community gets us free. I think grassroots organizing gets us free. I think you and me get us free. Mm-hmm. And so when I opt into those systems, when I operate within capital G government, it's with that very clear recognition that the goal is harm mitigation, not freedom, and that I have to seek that for myself in other places and with other people.
That is so, so powerful. Harm mitigation, people. Like, when we really look at it, I'm not going to endorse every single thing that any candidate does in this election, but and on a global and domestic level, right? Like, we know that America and what we do here impacts global issues. We're seeing it right now play out in real time. But to that point, and I guess not even but, and I also have to recognize that the decisions I make here will reflect broadly on a global scale, but also domestically. There's all of the things that we're holding right now, and I think that Raven has given us a lot to look at, Gen Z peers on listening to this, that sometimes maybe if you're going to be a single issue voter, your single issue may really need to be harm mitigation at this stage, and really sitting with that and reconciling okay, I'm not going to get everything today, but knowing that if I hold these people accountable, I might be able to continue to turn the tide. So I thank you so much, and we're going to let our guest question ask you a question, if we can pull that up.
Hello, I am Amaya Wayman. I'm 19 years old and I go to Tuskegee University in Tuskegee, Alabama. My question for you is, did you face any backlash with your political views and your content? And if so, how did you handle it?
Oh, wow. What an excellent question. I mean, I think maybe the flip side and perhaps more poignant question or shorter answer would be, have you not faced political or backlash for your political views? My goodness. Oh my God, I face so much political backlash for sharing my views online, for openly, trying to organize my community to make sure that Kamala gets voted into the presidency. Of course, I've been called a political shill in my comment section. I pretty much get those comments every single day. But to answer the question, I think my response has been everything that we've discussed in this conversation today. There are policies that she has propositioned that I don't agree with, but by and large, I believe that she is a candidate who is going to fight for communities on the margin. She is a candidate who cares about reproductive justice. She is a candidate who cares about climate change. She is a candidate who cares about the LGBTQ plus community. She is a candidate that I think, by and large, is moving us in a direction that I want to see us to go. And in the areas where I disagree with her, I will continue to dissent and organize. And I hope that holding of the both hand is not seen as a bad thing. I think that's actually integral to democracy. It's not personal. It is personal and it's political, right? And so, I think my response has been, I'm still holding the both and endorsement doesn't mean endorsement of every single positionality. It means a recognition that this is game time and it's about survival.
Amazing. Well, thank you, Amaya, for your question, and thank you, Raven, for holding the both and for all of us in the digital space and on this episode today. I'm very excited for people to listen in and hear your wisdom and your Torah, I'll say. And I really am excited to embark in this world and move through this political space, knowing that there's voices like you who are spearheading the movement for us in the online space as Gen Zers. So thank you for your time and for coming on Push the Next Generation, friend.
Thank you for having me. So fun.
Yay! We truly love to see it. If you want to submit a question to our guests, DM at Push the Next Generation Pod for a chance to make it onto future episodes. So as I mentioned at the top, we're going to try the news segment here. We may all hate this and say news at the top or bust, but we're in our era of listening and not judging. So let's just see how this goes. Now, I don't quite know where to begin. Seriously, this week has seen a mix of political developments, domestic and international conflicts, cultural milestones, and ongoing debates about technology and social media regulation. Also, how are we in December already? I have every intention of trying to keep this brief, but a lot has happened. So news updates to keep the girly pops and everyone else informed coming in 5, 4, 3, 2. United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson was murdered in broad daylight in New York City outside the Hilton Midtown Hotel heading to the company's annual investor conference. Investigations are underway. President-elect Donald Trump's transition team continues to make headlines. Kash Patel, Trump's pick for FBI director, has been promoting supplements claiming to detox people from COVID vaccines. Sit with that for a minute. Trump has named venture capitalist David Sachs as his AI and crypto czar. Elon Musk reportedly spent $250 million to support Trump's election, including funding a mysterious RGB PAC. Pete Hegseth, Fox News host turned defense secretary nominee, has been rocked by allegations of excessive drinking and a sexual assault claim. His mom's email sent to him in 2018 in which she begged him to stop lying, cheating, sleeping around with, using, and abusing the women in his life has gone viral. But when asked about it on Fox, she dodged the question and instead chose to point the finger back at the media. Trump is still publicly backing him, which isn't surprising, but also very publicly floating the idea that Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, yes, you heard that right, Ron DeSantis, could possibly be the Defense Secretary of the United States of America. Thoughts and prayers. Nearly 100 ex-national security officials expressed alarm at the prospect of Tulsi Gabbard leading the intelligence community, and Trump's pick to run the Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, Chad Chronister, withdrew from consideration after backlash from Republicans over his actions during the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as his previous remarks about immigration. That makes for 2 withdrawals so far. Notably, Trump's children are absent from his second-term team assembly. President Joe Biden issued a full and unconditional pardon to his son Hunter Biden on December 1st, 2024. The decision marks a reversal of Biden's previous statements that he would not pardon his son, and it should come as no surprise that this has been the subject of debate all week. In international news, Syrian rebels swiftly recaptured territory that President Assad's forces had spent years reclaiming. Health authorities in Congo reported that a mysterious illness has killed dozens of people, raising alarms about public health and safety in the region. Former Israeli defense minister accused Israel of war crimes and ethnic cleansing in Gaza, which members of the Israeli government adamantly refute. South Korean police and prosecutors opened separate insurrection investigations against their president over his failed martial law attempt. Protesters are calling for his impeachment. Australia passed a landmark law banning social media use for individuals under the age of 16, requiring platforms to implement age verification measures to protect children from online harm. And, not related, Taylor Swift's record-breaking Eras Tour is concluding in Vancouver, marking the end of a tour that has spanned 5 continents and nearly 150 shows. What a cultural landmark. And a German court ruled that a former Nazi camp guard, now age 100, can face trial for his involvement in war crimes during World War II, emphasizing ongoing efforts to seek justice for historical atrocities. What else was happening? Because this certainly wasn't enough, you may ask. Representative AOC announced her candidacy for a top position on the House Oversight Committee, signaling her intention to play a significant role in congressional investigations. Members of the transgender community and allies staged a sit-in protest at a U.S. Capitol bathroom against a proposed policy that would prohibit the country's first openly transgender member of Congress from using women's restrooms. About 15 protesters were arrested for unlawful demonstration. Not related, but I thought you all should know that co-defendants of Young Thug were acquitted in Georgia's longest criminal trial. Federal judges just upheld a law that could potentially ban TikTok in the U.S., citing national security concerns over data privacy and foreign influence. And Anthem Blue Cross Blue Shield halted their anesthesia payment policy after backlash, rightfully so. Village People singer Victor Willis went from opposing Trump's use of the song YMCA to defending it, now also adding that the song isn't a gay anthem. Let's pause there for the delulu-ness for a moment. And Spotify Wrapped and Apple Music Replay, the annual music listening summaries, were released this week. I was not surprised by my replay at all. It was incredibly on brand for me. Hope you guys have all checked out yours. And because Texas is Texasing, let's dig in there too. Texas Governor Greg Abbott is under scrutiny for threatening to pull funding from a children's hospital after a viral video showed a doctor criticizing Abbott's citizen mandate. Additionally, the Texas Maternal Mortality and Morbidity Review Committee announced it won't review maternal deaths from 2021 to 2023, coinciding with the implementation of the state's near-total abortion ban. And finally, as someone going to see Wicked tonight for the first time, I am proud to join all the social media users holding space for the lyrics of Defying Gravity from the musical Wicked. All I can say is look up the interview with Tracy Gilchrist, Cynthia Erivo, and Ariana Grande, and enjoy! Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, Push the Next Generation, recommend it to a friend, follow on socials at Push the Next Generation Pod. Thank you so much for watching and listening. I'll see you next week on Push the Next Generation. In the meantime, let's just, I really am into this whole let's just listen and not judge. Sit with that for the week. All right, this is Ashley Jackson signing off.